first rule of urban exploration is simple. Never go alone. The second rule, trust your gut. If a place feels wrong, it probably is. I'd broken the first rule a few times, but I'd never broken the second. Not until Buckhorn. Buckhorn wasn't just another abandoned town, it was a legend. A ghost story whispered in the darkest corners of urban explorer forums. Once a thriving dairy town, it had been swallowed by time and forgotten by the world. But the stories never faded. Shadowy figures in windows, whispers in the wind, warnings scrawled on walls in paint that never dried. Most people dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of overblown tales that come with any abandoned place. But not me. I'd seen enough to know that sometimes the stories are true. It was late October when we decided to go. There were 4 of us. Ethan, the driver with a knack for finding hidden roads. Jake, the jokester who could lighten any mood. Will, the quiet one who noticed everything. And me, the planner who always had the gear and the maps. We'd been exploring abandoned places for years, but Buckhorn felt like the ultimate challenge. The stories were too strange to ignore. Shadowy figures in windows, faint whispers in the wind. Warnings scrawled on walls. It was the kind of place that made you question whether you were alone, even when you knew you were. On the day of our trip, the air was crisp, the sky a heavy gray that promised rain. My crew had been itching for something new. We'd explored the usual spots, the grain silos in Pilsen, the prison near Joliet, the crumbling church in Gary. But Buckhorn was different. It was uncharted territory, a place that felt like it didn't want to be found. The drive was long, the kind of trip that makes you question your life choices. Ethan's van rattled like it was held together by duct tape and hope, and the roads got narrower the closer we got to Buckhorn. By the time we arrived, the sun was a faint glow behind the clouds, casting the town in a dull, lifeless light. It looked like any other abandoned place. Rotting buildings, cracked pavement, weeds pushing through the concrete. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The air felt heavier here, the silence too complete. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the first move. We started at the old schoolhouse, a 2-story building with windows like empty eye sockets. The door creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Desks were scattered like bones, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. Jake was the first to notice the chalkboard. In large, uneven letters, someone had written, "Danger." We laughed it off. Urban explorers loved leaving creepy messages to spook the next group. But Jake didn't laugh. He just stared at the word, his usual grin replaced by a frown. "Weird," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "I feel off." We moved on to the general store, its shelves still stocked with cans and jars from another era. The labels were faded, the contents long since rotted. Jake lingered near the back, his flashlight flickering over the dusty shelves. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "Hear what?" Will asked, glancing around. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "Nothing." "Never mind." But it wasn't nothing. As we explored, Jake grew quieter, his movements slower. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the shadows. By the time we reached the sheriff's office, the tension in the group was palpable. The building was small, its windows boarded up, but the door creaked open easily. Too easily. Inside, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it illegible. But one message stood out, spray-painted in jagged red letters. "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return." The words sent a chill down my spine. "Guys," I started, but before I could finish, Jake let out a choked gasp. Blood was streaming from his nose, dark and thick. It dripped onto the floorboards, pooling in the cracks. "Jake!" Ethan shouted, grabbing his arm. "What the hell?" Jake staggered backward, his breathing ragged. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice trembled. "It's just a nosebleed." But it wasn't just a nosebleed. The blood kept coming, staining his gloves and the floor beneath him. And then, as if in response, we heard it. 3 sharp knocks against the back door. The sound was deliberate, almost mocking. We froze. The door was boarded shut from the inside. "There's no way," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The knocks came again, louder this time. Jake flinched, his eyes wide and unfocused. He started whispering, his words too low to hear. But they weren't meant for us. He was talking to something else. "Jake," I said, grabbing his arm, "we need to go, now." His head snapped toward me, his eyes wild. "They're telling me to stay," he said, his voice hollow. "Who's telling you to stay?" Will demanded, his voice rising. Jake didn't answer. His nosebleed worsened, the blood now dripping in steady streams. He swayed on his feet, his knees buckling. Ethan and I caught him before he hit the floor, but he was heavy, his body limp. We dragged him out of the sheriff's office, his blood leaving a trail behind us. The van felt like a sanctuary, but even as we sped away, the tension didn't ease. Jake was unconscious in the back seat, his breathing shallow. Will kept glancing out the window, his face pale. "Something's following us," he muttered. "I can feel it." When we finally reached the highway, Jake stirred. He blinked rapidly, as if waking from a deep sleep. "What happened?" he asked, his voice weak. None of us answered. We didn't know how. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of Jake's blood on the floorboards haunted me, as did the sound of those knocks. Just as I was about to turn off my phone, a text came through from Will. It was a photo of the sheriff's office floor, taken from one of his cameras. The bloodstain was gone. Not dried, not smeared. Gone. And in its place, etched into the wood, were words that made my blood run cold. "He stays. You will return." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Jake was safe, asleep in his apartment. But the message wasn't about him. It was about us. Buckhorn wasn't done with us. And deep down, I knew we'd go back. We had to. Because the town wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. And whatever was there, it wasn't going to let us go that easily. The first time I saw Millburg, Utah, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the desert heat, a figment of my exhausted mind after hours of driving through the barren wasteland of eastern Utah. But as I got closer, the town came into focus, a cluster of crumbling buildings, their windows dark and lifeless, like the hollow eyes of a skull. I didn't know it then, but Millburg wasn't just a ghost town. It was a trap. The story starts, as most bad decisions do, with a simple mistake. I decided to visit a friend in San Francisco, which meant a drive of over 1,000 miles from my hometown of Montrose, Colorado. My plan was simple: drive through Utah in a single day, stay overnight at the Holiday Inn in a small place called Eerie, Nevada, and then drive the rest of the way to San Francisco after a good night's sleep. I made it on time and in one piece. But that doesn't mean the journey went smoothly. It might sound odd, but I'd never actually been to Utah before. Even though it was less than 100 miles west of Montrose, I'd always traveled east, toward Boulder or Denver. I knew eastern Colorado was desolate, but Utah was something else entirely. The landscape past Delta looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Endless stretches of desert, eerie rock formations, and a sky so vast it felt suffocating. About 30 to 45 minutes past Delta, I realized I had made a huge mistake. I should have stopped for gas. My fuel gauge was creeping dangerously toward empty. I started to panic a little. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded in the middle of nowhere. You can imagine my relief when I saw a sign up ahead. Last chance gas. 5 miles. I exhaled, muttering a "thank God" under my breath, even though I wasn't much of a believer. A few minutes later, I saw a small town appear on the horizon, clinging to the highway like it had been forgotten by time. The buildings were old, paint peeling, windows cracked. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but I didn't care. I just needed gas. As I pulled into the station, gravel crunched under my tires. There were no other cars, no people, no movement at all. When I turned off the engine, I realized how silent everything was. So silent that I could hear my own heartbeat. The whole town felt wrong. I stepped out and grabbed the pump, but no gas came out. I tapped it against the side of the pump. Tried again. Nothing. Maybe the station attendant could help, I thought, so I stepped inside the small store. The door creaked loudly, a bell ringing overhead, the sound cutting through the eerie stillness. Inside, the air was stale, like no one had been there in years. The shelves were stocked with snacks from another era, faded packaging with logos I hadn't seen in decades. The cash register was ancient, all metal with heavy buttons. A calendar hung behind the counter, frozen in time. June 2001. That's when the unease crept in. A newspaper sat on the counter, its yellowed pages reporting on a festival that was supposed to happen 8 years ago. I swallowed hard. It was like the entire town had just stopped. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. My voice echoed back at me. I peered into the back room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, there was an old coffee mug on the desk, its contents dried into a dark crust. A jacket hung on the back of a chair, waiting for its owner to return. A radio sat on a shelf, plugged in but silent. I backed away and turned toward the window. Across the street, a playground stood still, rusted swings swaying slightly in the wind. But something wasn't right. One of the swings was moving more than the others. Someone had just been there, watching me. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Despite every logical bone in my body telling me to leave, something pulled me forward. I needed to know more. I walked through the town, testing doors. Most were locked, but one was slightly ajar. Inside, it looked as if the family had left in a hurry. A book lay open on the couch. A plate of food sat abandoned on the dining table. Now nothing but dust and decay. Upstairs, a child's room was frozen in time. Scattered toys on the floor, a blanket half draped over a bed, as if someone had just woken up and left mid-play. That's when I heard it, a soft click behind me. I spun around, heart hammering. The closet door in the corner of the room was open just an inch wider than before. I wasn't alone. Adrenaline surged through me. I backed out of the house, trying to stay calm, but every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run. I made it to my car, locking the doors the second I got inside. My hands shook as I turned the key, my gaze darting toward the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind me. Nothing. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires spitting gravel as I tore out of that town. My gas light was on, and I had no idea if I'd make it. But staying there wasn't an option. By some miracle, I coasted into Ely on fumes, barely able to breathe until I reached a Chevron station. As I filled up, I noticed my phone had service again. I hesitated, then stepped inside to ask the clerk about the town. His blank stare told me everything. He had no idea what I was talking about. That unsettled me, but what disturbed me more was when I called the local sheriff's office. The first deputy seemed casual about it, almost dismissive. "Oh, you must mean Millburg. Place has been abandoned for years." Relief washed over me. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the better of me. But then I asked why the town had been abandoned. Silence. Then the deputy asked, "You some kind of reporter?" When I said no, his tone shifted. "Why don't you stop by the office in Fillmore? We can talk about it in person." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I declined. I had no desire to dig any deeper. My friend in San Francisco told me to just forget about it, pretend I had never seen Millburg. "Sometime," he said, "ignorance is bliss." Maybe he was right. But on my way back, as I neared Utah again, I spotted Millburg in the distance. Something dark moved between the buildings. Not the wind, not an animal, something watching. I gripped the wheel and sped up, flying past the town in seconds. And this time, I didn't look back. It wasn't until weeks later, back in Montrose, that I noticed something strange. My car, which had been running fine since the trip, suddenly wouldn't start. I popped the hood and there, nestled in the engine, was a small rusted key. It looked old, like something from the 1950s. Attached to it was a tag, the writing faded, but still legible. Millburg City Limits. My blood ran cold. I hadn't been near my car's engine since the trip. How had it gotten there? That night I dreamed of the town. The swings were moving again, But this time I was the one sitting on them. The wind whispered my name, and when I looked up, the buildings were no longer empty. Faces pressed against the windows, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted into silent screams. I woke up in a cold sweat, the key clutched in my hand. I don't know what Milberg is, or why it chose me, but I do know this. It's not done with me. And the next time it calls, I'm not sure I'll be able to resist. There are places in this world where the line between reality and myth blurs, where the wind carries whispers of the unknown, and the sea holds secrets darker than its depths. The Flannan Isles are one such place. The last entry in the lighthouse log was brief, scrawled in frantic handwriting. The storm has returned. The sea calls. We must go. December 15th, 1900. 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on the desolate Flannan Isles, a cluster of jagged rocks off the Scottish coast, vanished without a trace. No bodies were found, no signs of violence, only a lighthouse frozen in time. Beds were unmade, half-eaten meals sat cold on the table, and a clock had stopped ticking, its hands forever fixed at 8:45. The official report would later claim that a rogue wave swept the men out to sea. But those who knew the keepers, and the islands, whispered of something far more sinister. The Flannan Isles had long been a place of fear and superstition. Ancient Celtic myths spoke of unseen watchers, vengeful spirits, and strange lights that danced on the cliffs at night. The islands were once home to an abandoned monastery, its ruins still standing like a silent warning. Legend had it that the monks had fled in terror, speaking of voices in the wind and shadows that moved in defiance of the sun. The locals avoided the islands, calling them cursed, but the lighthouse had to be manned, and so the keepers went. When the relief crew arrived on December 26, they expected chaos. The logbook had mentioned severe storms, and the islands were notorious for their brutal weather. Instead, they found something deeply unsettling. The storm shutters were fastened tight. The lighthouse lamp was polished and functional, as if it had been tended to moments before their arrival. The logbook, however, told a different story. The entries began normally enough, detailing the daily routines of the keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. But as the days passed, the tone shifted. December 12th, severe storm. The waves crash higher than the tower. MacArthur prays nonstop. December 13th. The wind howls like a living thing. Marshall swears he saw a light in the sky, moving against the wind. December 14th. Duckett refuses to leave the lantern room. He says the sea is watching us. The final entry, dated December 15th, was the most chilling. Silence. We are not alone. The relief crew searched the island, but there was no sign of the keepers. No footprints leading to the cliffs. No debris washed ashore. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The only clue was a black rock found near the edge of the west landing, smooth and unnaturally cold to the touch. It was covered in strange carvings that did not match any known Celtic markings. The relief crew took it as evidence, but it disappeared from the investigation records shortly after. The official explanation was a rogue wave, but skeptics argued against it. The lighthouse was perched nearly 200 feet above the ocean. What kind of wave could have reached them there? Others suggested madness, prolonged isolation, the ceaseless crash of the waves, and the ever-present wind could have driven one or all of them to insanity. Did one of the keepers turn on the others? Did paranoia push them into the sea, one after another? The fact that MacArthur was known for his temper only fueled speculation, but there were darker theories. The keepers had reported strange lights in the sky in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, flickering, darting movements like distant fire. Some locals believed they had been taken, not by the waves, but by something from the stars. Others whispered of the black rock, calling it a gateway or a warning. Had the keepers stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent? Something that had been waiting on the islands long before the lighthouse was built? The truth of what happened on that fateful December night remains lost to time, swallowed by the merciless sea. Whether by natural disaster, madness, or something beyond human understanding, the Flannan keepers became part of the island's legend, another haunting whisper carried on the wind. Even now, modern visitors claim to hear strange voices when the wind howls through the ruins. Some say they've seen three figures standing in the mist, staring toward the sea, waiting. For what? No one dares to ask. Thanks for tuning in to Darkly Wired. If you enjoyed this dive into the shadows, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Have a story you think belongs in the darkness? Send it over to darklywired88@gmail.com. You might just hear it featured in a future episode. All links are in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and stay wired. Bye for now.